Okay, thank you very much, Jerry, and good evening. It's a real privilege to follow on from Isabel. I always find it particularly humbling when someone can deliver such a clear and articulate presentation in a language that is not their own. I sometimes struggle to do that in my own language, but I'll do my best this evening. Also, unlike Isabel, I'm going to need one or two props, and if the presentation can sort of start there. I'm going to mention some of the same things that Isabel did, but from slightly different perspectives, because when I first became involved in World Heritage, around about the time that I was working in the northeast of England and Hadrian's Wall was part of a World Heritage Site, I thought, yes, I understand all about World Heritage and I understand what UNESCO is. And so when the opportunity sort of came to undertake the international role that I'm privileged to have for Historic England at the moment, I thought, yeah, that'd be fine. I know it all. Wrong. Seriously wrong. And one of the things that I found really helpful was to actually sort of wind back. And Isabel referred to the foundation of UNESCO at the same time as the United Nations at the very end of the Second World War. And one of the things that I had completely missed, and maybe some of you who are here this evening have missed, is that the objective of UNESCO is really to support UN activities which are sort of primarily sort of aimed at fostering sort of cooperation between countries, avoiding the type of devastating sort of conflicts that have been seen in the past, and adopting the strapline of bringing peace in the minds of men and women. And that is absolutely sort of crucial because it does that through the three main elements that are in the acronym: education, science and culture. At the end of the Second World War, the world leaders and the politicians recognized that if we were just going to be reliant on diplomacy in future, then we wouldn't get all that far. It needed education and understanding, it needed scientific development, and it needed the recognition of cultural values as something to bring people together. And that remains a message that is as necessary today as it was over 70 years ago, and to my mind remains inspirational. And so World Heritage Sites, such as the one we have here in Liverpool, at heart are all part of this bigger picture. As Isabel mentioned, one of the early conventions in the post-war period was the 1954 Hague Convention, which was all about the protection of cultural property in times of conflict. And this was obviously uppermost in the minds of people who'd seen the absolutely devastating effect of war on some of our finest cultural objects and places. But also there is more to it than that, and the reason for picking this particular slide of the Custom House by John Foster, just down the road from here, is to not only evidence the damage that was caused by the incendiary bombs during the Second World War, but also to recognise the fact that it was actually demolished after the war in 1948, largely as a result of economic and financial pressures. And so there is something that we are still dealing with in a different environment today, the balance between these competing pressures sometimes of conservation of outstanding historic buildings with economic and social necessity. And it was, of course, the recognition that infrastructure development, redevelopment in post-war periods could cause as much of a threat to our outstanding heritage as the conflict itself. And I think that's sort of well expressed by the Custom House here in Liverpool. So just running through sort of briefly, the convention was ratified by the UK in 1984, and a couple of years later the first World Heritage Sites were inscribed. There are now well over 1,000 World Heritage Sites. The UK saw the Lake District, which I'll mention a bit later on, inscribed on the World Heritage List earlier this year, and the Jodrell Bank Observatory is due to be submitted for consideration next January. And one of the things that Jerry picked up on in his introduction was the words he'd heard about Liverpool being a World Heritage City, regardless of whether it has World Heritage status. And yes, that is absolutely right. But I think what the World Heritage status brings is this international collaboration which Isabel referred to. Primary responsibility for looking after these sites rests with individual countries, but there is a duty to cooperate and collaborate in the protection, conservation, management, interpretation and presentation of these wonderful places. And when or if you have the sort of privilege of attending the World Heritage Committee, to see representatives of the vast majority of these 193 countries all in the room together, to see the 21 member countries of the World Heritage Committee seriously sort of considering the issues in front of them, it is actually sort of quite humbling to feel part of such a major international exercise. And that would be something that, in my view, would be a huge loss if we were unable to sustain that. So I won't dwell long on these because Isabel has mentioned these already. Article 4, I would just remind people of the World Heritage Convention, does require countries that sign up to it, and of course it is an entirely voluntary exercise to sign up to it. We don't have to, but the countries that do are required to do their utmost to look after these outstanding places. It's also worth remembering that there is this international collaboration which I've just mentioned, but beyond that, and something that I think is particularly relevant to this evening's proceedings, is that Article 5 of the Convention does make clear that community engagement and participation is seen as a crucial part. This was, I think, forward-thinking at the time when the Convention was first put into place, and initially it didn't perhaps sort of carry a great deal of weight within the World Heritage community, but it has become more and more central. And what I think we're all about through this sort of seminar series is looking at ways in which you, the people who live and work in and around this World Heritage Site, may be able to become more positively engaged in decisions that affect it, including those decisions that affect it on the international stage. So, as I mentioned earlier on, the first 6 UK World Heritage Sites, and you can see some of them listed there, were inscribed just over 30 years ago. And as I say, a lot of those were inscribed on the basis of experts within English heritage and 1 or 2 other places, perhaps a little bit of involvement from local councils and other stakeholders, but really nothing that looked like community participation or engagement as we would recognise it today. By comparison, the Lake District, which spent a long time in evolution before it became a World Heritage Site, was the subject of a very high level of community engagement and participation as the nomination was developed. direct contact with the 40,000 people that live within the Lake District, engagement with the principal groups of people, and I would say as a result of that, potentially a much stronger feeling of ownership than it was possible to achieve in Liverpool to the run-up to inscription back in 2004. So there you see the Lake District, and I'm just going to say a little bit about it, and also one other case to illustrate some of the values that Isabel was talking about. And the core of this all is outstanding universal value, as Isabel mentioned. And I think in the context we face in Liverpool this evening, it's worth remembering that it is not just about the significance of the heritage that we have inherited. That is one pillar of outstanding universal value. But it's got to be authentic. It's got to be the real McCoy. Are there documentary sources there to sort of flesh out what we see on the ground? And it's also about integrity. How much about what is special about this place is actually surviving today? But the one I think it's worth drawing particular attention to is the third pillar, which relates to protection and management, because these three pillars, if you think of them like a three-legged stool, if one of those legs is kicked away, the stool falls over. And so unless the protection and management provisions that are in place are adequate to protect the authenticity and integrity of the place, then the World Heritage Site status is indeed at risk. So I think that's a particularly telling point for where we are in Liverpool at the moment. So if we look at what makes up the outstanding universal value of the Lake District, there are three interrelated values. There is the harmonious beauty created by the interaction of humanity with the natural environment. There was the inspiration that this provided for poets and artists, and also there was the inspiration that was provided for the birth of the conservation movement. So these are these sort of values which, as Isabel mentioned, are not physical values but they in themselves, but they are expressed in that landscape. So that gives a little indication of how this works. And I'll just pick one other sort of case which is sort of very different. In Cornwall and West Devon, you have the outstanding mining landscapes in 10 separate areas within those two counties, straddling an enormous sort of part of it. And I'm just going to look at one part of it. This is an aerial view of the town of Hale, which is an important part of the World Heritage Site. And just look briefly at what the attributes, if you like, the characteristics of this outstanding universal value actually are. So in the case of Hale, this is the principal mining port. It was where produce sort of came in to fuel the industry. It was where copper was exported, and Hale has the manufacturing centres, the foundries for the beam engines, the technology of which was so crucial to mining and which was transported throughout the world. So all those are expressed within the physical fabric of the place you saw in the previous slide. And there are, of course, other attributes that you see here, very distinctive types of settlement that express the history and value of what has been going on. So if we come to Liverpool, and Isabel talked about the outstanding universal value of the place we have here, I'm just sort of articulating, if you like, the difference between the physical attributes and the ones that express the wider historic values. So in the sort of top part of it, you can see the physical side of it: dock construction, port management, But then that is all part of the building up of the international mercantile systems throughout the British Commonwealth. And you see also the early development of global trading and cultural connections throughout the British Empire. So what we have in the World Heritage Site here is the physical expression of those values, and those are the values that World Heritage Site status and our signing up to the convention requires us to sustain. So you can see them symbolised in structures like the Victoria Clock Tower, the entrance to the core part of Jesse Hartley's half-tide dock system. And it is these sort of areas that we need to protect, not just physically, but also their setting, so that they can still be understood by future generations as the process of change in the area is managed. And at that point, I will stop.
Thank you very much.